pandemic has exposed the inadequacy of capitalism and its political representatives to millions worldwide at a brutal rate. But in the trade unions, we know that just because something is exposed as being wrong, it doesn't mean it will stop happening. Our experience is in the trade unions is that you have to fight to put it right. Look at the Haringey carers that had to both strike and take legal action against their employers to win legal pay rates. The government of Eton-educated political columnists has mishandled the COVID response, resulting in the deaths of nearly 55,000 people. They've prioritised handling the news about COVID rather than the crisis COVID has created. They've prioritised their ideology that profiteering private business is the best way to beat COVID despite all the evidence. £11 billion handed to private companies to provide equipment to fight COVID, some of which is never used because it was inadequate, and £3 billion of which is still unaccounted for. £130 million on private consultants, including £670,000 on PR consultants, not medical consultants, but PR consultants in the vaccine task force, and a private sector head of Test, Track and Trace whose previous experience as the head of TalkTalk was to allow thousands of customers' private details to be stolen, but yet can't trace 50% of COVID contacts. And who is leading the attack on behalf of workers, frontline workers who have lost their lives in the NHS, on the buses, providing essential services, and the thousands in care homes who definitely have not had a wall of protection around them against COVID? You'd be forgiven for thinking Marcus Rashford was the only attacker forcing the government into 2 U-turns on meals for millions of children living in poverty. Just imagine if the most powerful trade unions were led by socialists this year. We would have not have closed down for the first few months of the pandemic, or we would have put together instead a trade union national action plan for the production of PPE under democratic workers' control. Firstly, renationalising companies like NHS Logistics to determine demand, regulate production and quality, and ensure distribution. We'd have not just posed this as a serious alternative, but would have organised trade union members in the NHS and those private companies to demand emergency powers are used to bring this about. A socialist leader of UNISON, the largest trade union, would have demanded an end to the private care catastrophe by calling for the provision and staffing of care homes to be brought into public sector under democratic workers' control, of joint local authority and health boards, to end the cross-contamination from hospital to care home, the cross-contamination from the use of agency staff, and the end of the chronic staffing shortages, even recruiting some of the furloughed workers on trade union rates of pay into the sector. Again, this would have not just been an empty call, but a mobilisation of workers in the sector, patients and relatives demanding safety first. A socialist leadership of the major trade unions would demand testing and tracking was put into the hands of local joint health and local authority boards, democratically accountable, that recruit an army of trained trackers in the best tracking techniques to track 100% of those in contact with infected people. A socialist leadership of the main trade unions would have demanded 100% pay for all furloughed workers and all that have been asked to isolate, and not stood with Tories for payments that undermine their livelihoods. We could have mobilised 6 million workers in the ranks of the TUC and recruited more around this demand alone. A socialist leadership of the education unions would have demanded emergency funding for schools to deliver a mix of online and in-class education on the basis of safety first, and access for all the resources needed to do that, including free access to the internet and IT equipment. A socialist leadership in the health unions would have been at the forefront of a claim for 15% pay rise for all NHS staff, who've put in more than 15% of unpaid hours into making sure during this COVID times that during the COVID crisis to save lives. And now the Tories plan to divide public sector workers from those in the private sector with a public sector pay freeze. We know in the trade unions that inaction only encourages further attacks. That's why a socialist leader of Britain's largest trade union, UNISON, would be calling for an emergency NEC meeting of the union to draw up an action plan to put all of the public sector trade unions together and demand that we won't pay for the COVID crisis in the following years. Over the last few years, our pay is now 20% lower in real terms than what it was in 2009. We could make official the NSSN's call for a day of action on the 5th of December of all public sector workers. And the GMB have just announced they will organise national strike action to fight British Gas, threatening to sack and rehire staff in that company on worse pay terms and conditions. UNISON has significant membership. We should be coordinating with them so that all workers in that industry take action against the cuts to their pay terms and conditions. And public sector jobs, especially in local councils, are in the firing line too. A socialist leader of UNISON would want to bring together all those facing cuts into a national strategy to fight back, oppose all the cuts councillors, not a penny of union members' money to Labour councillors making cuts. And let's look again at political representation. Shouldn't we be demanding now discussion and debate in our unions about how best to represent workers' political interests? Keir Starmer is desperate to prove that he is a safe pair of hands for British capitalism by backing every Tory measure to solve this crisis. That's why he is prepared to roll back and humiliate the memory of Corbyn's 4 years of leadership of the Labour Party. I believe a socialist trade union leader would campaign for a new party to represent workers, starting by calling for a conference of trade unionists to discuss how best to achieve this. This year, I am standing for UNISON General Secretary in the election that closes next Friday. Think what difference electing a socialist General Secretary could make for the lives of millions of workers with a programme to transform our unions. I want to thank those UNISON members that are listening in to this meeting who have campaigned for support for me. But it's not just for me. They've campaigned to build a body of ideas in our trade union movement that could build and end the misery of capitalism. Thank you very much.